Welcome to the presentation on multicultural and social justice competencies. There are 5 objectives that we have for this presentation. The first one is to review the definitions of privilege and oppression, increase awareness of our own identities as counselors and the way in which these identities affect the client-counselor relationship, increase awareness of the experience of clients who face oppressive factors, understand the impact of oppressive factors on clients' socio-emotional well-being, and understand the role of advocacy in the counseling process. I would like to start by doing a review of the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies. And these competencies were recently revised in 2016. They talk about 4 main areas. The first one is named counselor self-awareness. In this area, the competencies are asking for us to explore our own attitudes and beliefs as counselors and to increase our knowledge and skills and take actions that will help us to continuously become aware of who we are and the type of identities that we bring into the room. So what type of actions are we taking to increase our own self-awareness? An example could be, how am I exposing myself to understand better how the history or current events, historical or current events, are affecting my own identities as a counselor, and understanding more my own assumptions, for example, about other people that have different identities from mine. The second area is calling for us to become more aware of clients' worldview. So it's not enough to become aware of who I am and my own attitudes and belief systems that I bring into the room, but I also need to become very sensitive and aware of my clients' worldview, my clients' values, my clients' belief systems. Here I need to be asking, what are my clients' identities and how these identities shape my clients' experiences in society. Do they experience privilege in society, or do they experience oppressive factors? And how are these different experiences affecting their presenting issue, as well as how their perception and their view of current situations in their lives? The third area is called counseling relationship, and in this area, we're asked to consider how the intersectionality of both counselors' identities and clients' identities affect the counseling relationship and the therapeutic relationship that exists. In this For this area, some examples could be for a counselor to develop knowledge of theories explaining how counselor and client's privilege and marginalized identities influence the relationship, and then acquire skills to determine when I need to address these differences between me and my client, or similarities, and address the impact that these different intersectionality of identities are having on the relationship. How am I bringing those in a way that is therapeutic for my client and that helps me to maintain the counseling relationship and in a positive way. And finally, these competencies are calling for us to be aware of counseling and advocacy interventions. In other words, that we have to be working from a social justice framework. It's not enough for me to be aware of my clients' presenting issues, but also I need to conceptualize how those presenting issues are being affected by their experiences in society as it relates to privilege or oppressive factors, and how then once I become aware of that, what am I doing with my client or on behalf of my client to engage in advocacy. For example, a client that is being exposed to oppressive factors in society, and I know that is affecting their presenting issues, and is affecting their self-identity, self-esteem, socio-emotional well-being. Then what am I doing? What specific actions am I taking with my client or on behalf of my client to advocate for eliminating or mitigating those oppressive experiences. It is not enough to just work one-on-one in the counseling room, but it is important to take it one step further and to become aware of those oppressive factors and also actions that can be taken in order to mitigate those effects. Um, Part of this could be to empower clients and work with clients directly on how they can um, engage in some actions to remove some of those barriers themselves, or it could be that I actually engage in some advocacy by myself individually that can eventually help to remove some of those oppressive factors. And the similarly to privilege identities, right? So how do I help my client to become more aware of those privilege identities and how that privilege identities can be used as a way to advocate. I believe this slide, which presents the respectful model, can help us understand better what I am referring to by when I talk about identities. In my previous slide, I talked quite a bit about the different identities that the counselor brings in and the different identities that the clients bring in and the intersectionality of those identities in the room. And this slide can help us to put more into put some names to those identities and understand better, perhaps a little bit better what I'm referring to. If we look at the model, we can see all the different identities that the authors are talking about in here. And some examples are religion and spirituality, or the socioeconomic class of a client or the counselor, sexual identity, personal style and level of education, ethnic and racial identity, the chronological age or developmental stage that somebody is in, uh, past history of trauma and crisis, family background, unique physical characteristics to each individual, the location of residence and the primary language of the individual. All of these different identities are going together to form the culture that each individual is going to bring in into the counseling room, whether it's as a counselor or as a client. And this respectful model is not it includes many different identities, but as you can see, there are perhaps many more identities that we could include in here that are very specific to each of us individually. And I actually encourage you to be thinking about that. What are your three main identities? If you could think about which are the main identities that you identify with and that you feel are very core to who you are as a person and to your values and the belief system that you have, which could be those three identities. And some of them may not even be right here represented in the model. For example, I can think of myself and thinking that one of my identities right now that is very important to me is being a mother and what being a mother means for me and the value system and the cultural background that that brings into my life. A couple of kind of notes that I want to make is that I want you to be aware that some of these identities can actually change over time. So, for instance, socioeconomic class is an identity that could change depending on a person's circumstances, but some of them cannot change. For instance, racial or ethnic identity. Some of them are very visible and people can understand. For instance, somebody's first language versus second language usually can be easily uh, seen or heard when the person speaks. But then some other ones are what we call more hidden identities, and these are identities that are not always easily recognizable, but that and so the client actually or the person, the individual can have a choice to hide them or to show them. And then an example would be sexual identity. And a person can actually be able to a person could choose to hide that identity from other people around them. What is important to understand about the respectful model in all of these identities is that each of these identities, as I said before, are going to bring either privileged or oppressive experiences into our lives. So, if our identity is the identity that is most accepted in the society that we live in and in our community, that will be an identity that is going to bring more privileged experiences. But if the opposite is true, and some of our identities are more into the minority, are associated with minority groups and groups that are not the dominant group in that society, those identities may bring more oppressive experiences into our lives. So they're all going to affect the way in which we experience life, and also, as we're going to see later on, the socio-emotional well-being and even self-esteem of somebody. As we talk more about privilege and oppression, I think it's important to remind ourselves of the different definitions for these two concepts. So, the first one, as you can see on this slide, it says privilege is a feature of social systems, not individuals. People have or don't have the privilege depending on the system they're in and the social categories other people put them in. And I like this definition by Johnson because it really reminds us that when we talk about privilege and oppression, we're really talking about a systemic issue, not at the individual level. Now, as individuals within that system, then we are going to either be looked upon being privileged, and we're going to actually have privilege in that system, or we're going to be exposed to more oppressive factors in that system. All depends on how our identities are viewed and what category other people can put those identities within the society that we live in. For oppression is defined as a system that allows access to the services, rewards and benefits and privilege of society based on membership in a particular group. So oppression cannot exist without privilege. In order for a group to have less access to resources, that means that there is a group that has more access to resources within that the social norms that the groups live in. And an example of this could be the more socioeconomic status one has, the more access to resources that person has, and that access to resources will open more opportunities and better opportunities. And this actually starts at a very, very early age. And again, in some of these, this may change throughout somebody's lifetime, but some other identities that are not cannot be changed are gonna always be either looked upon as an identity that brings more privilege into somebody's life or more oppressive factors into somebody's life. Here is an example. This is a model by Hayes. It was created back in 2001, and it really reminds us of some of the identities that have the most privilege or dominant status within the society that we live in. So, if somebody is able to speak English, that usually allows for more access to resources, and also is viewed as a more dominant status in this society. The same with able-bodied, being Christian, reside in the country where you are born. So this, for example, for me is very true. Where when I living in my home country in Venezuela, I never saw myself as a minority, and then I came to the United States, and that identity for me changed. So I went from having more of an identity status, dominant status, and that was privileged, to actually coming to an status that is viewed as a minority and maybe not as in such a positive light. I guess my racial and ethnic identity in this country as an immigrant is different than what it was in my home country. It is also within this society, the white Western European American heritage is looked at as the dominant status. Heterosexual males, light, fair skin tone, middle and upper class, and the ages between 30 and 50 years. These tend to be more of the identities that are looked upon as dominant in this society. So any identity that is not doesn't fit this usually is more associated with being less than or not as perhaps as good as these other identities. So, as a review, I would like to bring attention to comparing and contrasting privilege and oppression. First of all, these two concepts are originated at the systemic level. It depends on the society that we live in and the values that the society adheres to. Oftentimes, we do not recognize privilege or acknowledge oppression until we are faced with an experience that makes us connect emotionally to those concepts. So it takes for us to actually be exposed to some type of experience that helps us to emotionally connect to what it's like to have privilege or oppression in one's life in order for us to recognize that these concepts even exist. They're usually out of awareness until that happens. Recognizing privilege does not mean that we want to discount an individual's hard work. And this is something that I often hear is people thinking, oh, that means that if I belong to one of these identities that are associated with being dominant, and I know that I got better access to resources because of those identities, that means that I didn't work hard for what I have, and that's not at all what it means. And so it is important to recognize that I the fact that I maybe had some of my privileged identities offer me more access to resources still doesn't mean that I didn't work hard to also achieve my goals. But it does mean though that I had the society that I was living in allow me to have more access to resources compared to other people. So it doesn't discount my hard work, but it does help me to acknowledge that there are some privileged experiences that I had that allow me to have more access in life. Most of us have identity that bring both experiences into our lives. So an example could be as a woman experiencing oppression as a female in this society, but as a middle upper class individual experiencing privileges. And this also helps people to understand better these concepts because then you get to realize that usually you can find different identities, whether it's religion, spiritual identities, ethnic, sexual orientation, but you may be able to find different identities within yourself that bring both. Some bring privileged experiences and some bring oppressive experiences. And recognizing privilege should lead to action. So let's not be paralyzed by guilt. Guilt usually paralyzes us. Responsibility helps us to move forward. So once I realize what privileged identities I have, the next question becomes how do I use that privilege in a way that advocates for social change and that advocates to have a more fair and equal system in this society, because the guilt is not going to really help me to advocate or to get there. But my acceptance of that responsibility and the responsibility that comes with that does lead me to action and positive action. One concept that we want to be aware of as we talk about oppressive experiences and privileged experiences is the microaggressions, the concept of microaggressions, because this is actually one of the most prevalent ways in which we experience oppression in this society. These are the meaning messages sent to members of oppressed groups that are constantly being sent in our society. They can be sent at the social level, the societal level, which is, for instance, through TV images. So when you turn on the TV, what do you see? Do you see people that look like you in positions of power, or do you see them always in lesser positions, even within the movies? That we are exposed to, how are different races, ethnic groups, or members of different groups, religions are being represented on TV or in the movie industry. Microaggressions can also happen at the individual level, and that is when you hear somebody, for instance, saying a racist joke, telling a racist joke, and that is another form of microaggression that is happening at the individual level. It can be verbal, but it also can be non-verbal. And a non-verbal, an example would be somebody that um, looks away or changes seats because they feel uncomfortable sitting next to a person that looks different from them, or that it is from a specific type of a specific racial background. And it can be intentional or unintentional. Many times we engage in microaggressions without even realizing, because again, a lot of these messages are messages that we get from a very early on in life, from childhood, and unless we are constantly seeking opportunities to become more aware and to work on those, we are unintentionally many times committing microaggressions. So many times we may say something and say, oh, I didn't mean it that way. And in reality, I did not mean it that way. It was not what I meant to say. However, it is still a microaggression. It still has a negative effect on the other person. So that's why those competencies that we talk about at the beginning are so important, because the going back to that first concept within the multicultural and social justice competencies, it talks about me becoming aware of my value system. The more I am aware of that, and I'm aware of like what assumptions I make about people from other racial groups or other ethnic groups or the religious group, the more that I'm aware of not engaging in microaggressions towards that group. And they can be subtle manifestations of internalized bias. So if I'm not aware of those biases that I may have towards other groups, then unconsciously I am going to engage in microaggressions without realizing it. The very important part of understanding here is that there is the cumulative impact of microaggressions leads to trauma. And the next couple of slides are going to talk more about this. But this is very important, that research continues to show time after time that the more that an individual is exposed to oppressive experiences, and microaggressions being one of those experiences, the more that is going to affect their mental, physical, socio-emotional well-being negatively. And so a lot of these cumulative microaggressions year after year in a daily life, in somebody's daily life, can actually lead to the same experience as trauma. For example, research shows that the experience of oppressive factor has a negative effect on individuals' physiological and psychological well-being. Members of oppressed groups are overwhelmed with having to constantly use their mental, emotional, and physical responses to survive and navigate the different challenges they face daily. What this research has shown is that for minority individuals living in a society where they're constantly being exposed to microaggressions or other type of oppressive experiences, they're constantly having to navigate how to take those in, whether they're internalizing those messages about themselves, or using the resources not to internalize those messages. And it is a constant battle to have to deal with those experiences in their daily life. So eventually, when there are many of those experiences every day for a long period of time, members of the press groups become very overwhelmed and can then affect their physiological and psychological well-being. One of the ways in which it affects somebody's emotional well-being is that experiencing discrimination leads to the overuse of the sympathetic nervous system. And if we know the function of the sympathetic nervous system is to always have to do that flight or fight response, and constantly having to be in kind of like on the lookout for how to defend oneself or how to survive. And that constant use of that sympathetic nervous system is what is part of what leads to that experience that is equal to trauma in somebody's life. Facing discrimination is related to physiological dysregulation. Again, going back to the sympathetic nervous system and the overuse of it, it can actually lead to physiological dysregulation, such as increased heart rate and high blood pressure. And discrimination is linked to mental health issues such as depression or anxiety, and also to physical problems like hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease. So we can see that the effects of oppression are actually long lasting and can be very, very detrimental to somebody's physical and mental health. Another part important to understand about the effects of oppression is that individuals who constantly face discriminatory messages in society may internalize such messages, and that it leads to what we call internalized oppression. This is when you actually, as a minority person, you start to believe the negative messages that you receive from society about your race or your ethnic identity, or your religious values. So that leads to lower self esteem. It leads to the individual unconsciously starting to feed the stereotype that society is putting on them. So if I constantly see myself as being the bad person, then I start to associate myself with being a bad person. I lower my self-esteem and I start to engage in behaviors that fit that stereotype because that's the message I'm getting. The picture here shows it comes from actually a video of an experiment that was done where and has been replicated a couple of times, where they have taken dolls, a white doll and a darker skin doll, and they have also had um, children, African American children and white children, come in and do, and they ask which doll is the good doll, and usually the majority of the time the children, both from both races, will choose the white doll as the good doll. So it shows that really it starts at a very early age. The children start to internalize what is good and what is bad, and which racial and ethnic identities are associated with being good and dominant, and which ones are associated with being negative in many ways. Facing oppressive factors lead to feeling hypervigilant, angry, mistrusting, fearful, fatigue, and hopeless. So we can see that the emotional stress that the oppressive factors put on individuals can be really, really detrimental to the emotional well-being. Here are some examples of systemic oppression. Some of these can be found in the educational system very easily, and so I wanted to bring attention for my first two bullet points about some of these systemic oppressive experiences that happen at a very early age in school settings. One is the achievement gaps in math and reading levels between schools in high socioeconomic neighborhoods versus low socioeconomic neighborhoods. Across the nation, when we look at the statistics, for the most part, we're going to find a very different level in achievement gaps, where the schools that are located in high socioeconomic neighborhoods are doing much better. Those kids in those schools are doing much better than the kids in the low socioeconomic neighborhoods schools. Um, Again, why and how and what are we doing in order to make this achievement gap disappear, because it is really affecting a lot of children at a very young age, because once they start getting behind, it's going to become harder for them to catch up to the level that they need by the time they get to college. Another example is how black and poor students are suspended at much higher rates than their white and non-poor peers. Then it leads us to ask why and what is it about the school system that is leading us to be suspending specific groups of students at a much higher rates than others. That again says something about the system and about whether that system is culturally responsive or how the system is biased and is more give more privileges to certain groups than other groups. Another example would be the payment and the differences in payment between women and men. And according to the Pew Research Center in 2017, and I quoted this from their website, it would take an extra 47 days of work for women to earn what men did in 2017. Across the nation, we continue to see how women are being paid less than men for the exact same job. And this is happening in most industries and at the national level. So it's another way of oppression that we see happening at the systemic level. I would like to ask for you to take a little break from listening to me just for a few minutes and click on the link for the video in this videotape. It's going to take you to a YouTube video, and sometimes when it takes you there, it will have like a little commercial for like a minute or so before the video clip starts. But this is actually a video clip that really shows, it's about 5 minutes, but it shows the discrepancies that we see and in the level of oppression that we can see in the different type of schools. In a school in a high level, high socioeconomic neighborhood versus a school in a low socioeconomic neighborhood. And you can really see very easily the lack of access to resources and the discrepancies in opportunities that these kids get, as well as the achievement gap. So I would like for you to take a minute and click on it, watch it, and then you can come back to the PowerPoint. Now that you took a moment to look at the video clip, I would like for you to reflect on it. For example, what are some thoughts and feelings that you have about the video clip? And if you want, I would encourage you to take a piece of paper and just write down your thoughts and answers to these questions. How do the experiences of the students in the video clip represent privilege versus oppressive experiences? Were you able to differentiate between the two? Can you see how the video clip represents that these concepts are a systemic issue and not an individual issue? And yet, when you think then at the individual level, I would encourage you to think about what could be the long-term effects for these students in terms of their exposure to whether the privileged experiences or the oppressive experiences or factors. And what do you think are going to be the long-term effects on their lives after you kind of imagine what their lives are going to be like in another 5 years? Take a moment to think about this and process this, and in terms of everything that I have been talking to up to this point. So when we talk about different identities and talking about the multicultural and social justice competencies, how does this video relate to that and bring that discussion to light for you? Now that you had a moment to kind of through the video clip see how these concepts that we've been talking about come to life and the effects that they may have on people's real lives, I would like to turn your attention to advocacy competency domains and I specifically expose you to this advocacy model that can help us to conceptualize what that next step is, what social advocacy means, and how we can engage in social justice advocacy work. The first, I would like to point out that as you can see on the chart, you have three different levels. You have the client or the student level, and because this is really talking about counselors who work in the school setting or counselors who work in the community. So you're going to hear this part of going back and forth between client and student, referring to clients in counseling. So client, you can be acting with client and students or acting on behalf of the client or the student. You can be acting at the school and community level, with the student or on behalf of students or clients, and also the public arena, and that can be also again with or on behalf. An example of working with a client could be to empower that client. And empowerment means allowing that client to become aware of the oppressive factors that they're exposed to, and then helping them to see and come up with ways in which they can advocate for themselves or with you. And an example could be for that video clip that we saw, and those students that are going back to the low socioeconomic school, the school that is located in the low socioeconomic neighborhood, then having, well, for one, the first step is helping them to become aware that many of these oppressive factors are really, they don't need to internalize that. They don't need to internalize that if they didn't do as well on math, it's because they're not as good or as intelligent, that this is not about a reflection of who they are, this is a reflection of the inequality of the system. And in doing that, then the clients can be helped. They can really help, it can help not to internalize that oppression, and that's the first step. And then it could lead into what type of empowerment, maybe what are some social actions that these students can engage in. Can they send letters and advocate for better resources for their school building, and better resources for their teachers, so that their teachers have more resources to be able to help them in their classrooms? Can they advocate to at the community level to have people from the community come to the school and help in the school to provide some of the resources that they're lacking? And also at the public arena, it could be to send letters to policymakers that are affecting the resources that are being brought to the school. So how do we advocate at that public level? And you can also do this many times as a counselor on behalf of the client, and this could be that while it is important and very powerful to empower clients, they may not always be in the position to be able to advocate. So then it is up to us to find ways that we can also advocate outside of the counseling relationship, and it is actually our responsibility to be using our privilege as counselors to be able to do that for our clients. And an example could be I work a lot with immigrant families, and so how am I advocating at the community or even at the public level for clients to, for the immigrant families to be exposed to a system and a community that seeks integration and that helps them to integrate into the community. At the school level, how are the schools doing that with the immigrant families that they are working with? Are they offering English as a second language classes, for instance? And that would be a way that we could, if we can advocate for ESL classes for the families of the students, that can be a way that we can help these the families to integrate better to society and to the school community. So this is a model that you can use as a way to help or conceptualize what advocacy may look like. And obviously it's going to depend on the very specific needs of the clients that you work with, the community that you're in. So asking questions such as, what are the oppressive factors that my clients are being exposed to in this community? How are these oppressive factors influencing their experiences and their presenting problems, their socio-emotional well-being? And then based on the answers, thinking about what are some actions that I can take on, whether it is with my client or on behalf of my clients. So as a way to end our presentation, I would like to just give a summary in these next two slides. This slide specifically talks about the social advocacy at the individual level. How do we help in clients at the individual level, especially clients that are exposed to internalized, to oppressive factors? The first one is helping them to become aware of that internalized oppression dynamic that happens. The more that they are able to become aware of the oppressive factors that they're being exposed to and the microaggressions, the more that they will be able to actively choose not to internalize those messages and to fight them, and the more that they are going to be empowered to take action against the oppression instead of just taking it in. Take time to be up to date with policies and laws that affect social oppression and advocate for changes in unfair policies, helping clients to become aware of those when it's possible, and allowing clients then to become aware of how they can advocate at that social level can be important. Another way could be to volunteer time or resources to organizations within your community that are already working to alleviate and to end oppression. And this organization usually needs a lot of volunteers and also other type of resources that if you are in a place to be able to provide, that could be a way for you to advocate. Stand up against microaggression, stereotypes, and discriminatory attitudes. It can be hard sometimes to have those conversations or bring that awareness to others, but it is a way to advocate on behalf of our clients as well as on sometimes actually on our own behalf, depending on what identities you're exposed to. Seek opportunities to engage in meaningful interactions with individuals from oppressed groups. I think one of the best ways in which we can learn about others' experiences in life is through meaningful interactions. And by meaningful interactions, I mean taking the time to actually get to know somebody that is different from us, somebody that comes from a different culture, and taking the time to hear their experiences and to hear what it's like to live in this society right now based on the identities that they represent. So, what can we do about it? First, really have a commitment to address your own internalized biases. We are all products of this system. So, have an internal commitment to continue to become aware of your internalized biases and seek out opportunities and trainings that can help you to continue that personal growth. It's a lifelong personal growth experience that we are committing to, and if we want to be able to be the best counselors that we can be, it is a necessary commitment and process to go through. Validate the anger, the betrayal, the hurt, the hopelessness that are felt by many of the oppressed groups. There is enough invalidation in society that one of the things that we can do is to be one of the people that validates that experience. So if you have clients specifically that are coming from having a lot of oppressive experiences, it's important for you to be able to hold a space for that person's anger and hurt and hopelessness to be there and to talk about it and to process through those feelings. Allow the members of the press group to define their own reality. Many times we say, "Oh no, but maybe you're exaggerating," and that that's the way that we perceive it from a privileged perspective. But for somebody that is living in that identity and being exposed to those oppressive factors, that's not the reality. So let's not define what is reality for somebody else. Let's accept it and allow the people living in those realities to define what that reality is like for them. Welcome and appreciate diversity rather than encouraging diverse individuals to act white. And what we mean is celebrate rather than de-emphasize differences. So let's recognize that we're different and let's celebrate those differences instead of putting them into specific boxes of what is better and what is worse, and instead of actually encouraging people to act more white or to adapt and acculturate, that we can actually appreciate diversity and the beauty that exists within diversity. Members of privileged groups should see it as their responsibility to change the system, own the power that comes with your privilege, and work to raise awareness among members of privileged groups. That is a privilege that you have, and if you have that privilege, then own that responsibility and use it in a way that can positively affect the system. And not to say those in oppressed group, but to equalize. So this is important, that if you are coming from an identity that is a privileged identity, that the idea is that you need to be the savior of other people, but that instead the idea is that you can use that privilege very responsibly to advocate for the equal treatment and for the end of oppressive factors in society. But it doesn't mean that you have to save the people in the other groups. So I hope this presentation was a way to just have a quick review of our multicultural issues. I would highly encourage you to really think specifically about how your identities are coming into the room, how you conceptualize and your clients, and how your level of empathy is being affected by your own identities. The more that you become aware of that, the more that you're going to be able to control the degree to which those are coming into place. And I encourage you also to conceptualize your clients holistically, to really be thinking about your clients' identities and how those identities bring different experiences and to your client's life, and how those experiences may affect or have an effect on your clients' presenting issues. With that, then you will become more aware of social advocacy and the need to engage in that advocacy. So I hope it was helpful, and it was a review that can help you to remind yourself of some of the responsibilities and the competencies that we need to make sure that we are aware of as counselors. And thank you for your time.